Act 1. The Scent of Pine and Silence. The town of Blackwood did not welcome outsiders, but it tolerated Arthur Pendleton because Arthur knew how to make wood speak. Arthur was a carpenter of the old school. He didn't use CNC machines, laser levels, or computer-aided designs. His hands, calloused and permanently stained with the dark walnut stain he favored, relied on chisels, hand planes, and an uncanny intuition. His workshop sat at the edge of the dense, suffocating pine forest that gave the town its name. It was a cavernous barn of weathered cedar, filled with the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut timber, the sweet aroma of beeswax, and the heavy, choking dust of 1,000 projects. To Arthur, sawdust wasn't waste. It was the skin of the trees, a golden blanket that covered his floors, muffled his footsteps, and drifted through the sunbeams like dormant fireflies. One chilly Tuesday evening in late October, as the fog began to roll off the mountains, a man arrived at Arthur's shop. The man didn't knock. He simply appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray twilight. He introduced himself only as Mr. Vance. He was tall, dressed in a woolen coat that seemed a shade too dark, and his eyes had the cold, glassy look of a stagnant pond. "I have a commission," Vance said. His voice was remarkably flat, devoid of any rising or falling inflection. "A specific one. And I pay well." Vance stepped aside to reveal a flatbed truck parked in the lane. On the back lay a massive, irregular log. It was nearly black, the bark gnarled and twisted like the musculature of a drowning man. It didn't look like pine, oak, or walnut. It looked ancient, heavy, and wet. "What kind of wood is that?" Arthur asked, stepping closer. A strange chill radiated from the timber, cutting through the warmth of his wood-burning stove. "It is an heirloom," Vance replied smoothly. "Harvested from the deep valley. I want you to construct a grandfather clock casing. It must be tall, hollow, and perfectly sealed. I will provide the internal brass mechanisms when it is complete." Arthur touched the wood. His fingers tensed. Usually, when he touched timber, he felt its history, the years of rain, the sunlight it had absorbed, the birds that had nested in its branches. This wood felt blank, cold, vacant, yet dense. "I can do it," Arthur said, driven more by professional curiosity than the thick stack of bills Vance produced from his coat pocket. "One condition," Vance added, his pale eyes locking onto Arthur's. "You must work alone. And you must not sweep the floor until the clock is finished. Let the shavings fall where they wish." Arthur frowned. It was an eccentric request, but craftsmen were used to eccentric clients. "As you wish. 2 weeks." 2 weeks, Vance echoed. Then, without another word, he helped Arthur winch the massive black log into the workshop, climbed back into his truck, and vanished into the fog. Act 2. The first shaving. The next morning, Arthur began the grueling process of milling the log. Standard steel saw blades usually sliced through timber like butter, but the moment Arthur's circular saw touched the black wood, the blade shrieked. A high-pitched, metallic wail filled the shop, forcing Arthur to don heavy ear defenders. Even through the plastic mufflers, the sound was agonizing. It didn't sound like friction, it sounded like a protest. When the first slab was finally cast off, Arthur noticed 2 things. First, the wood was entirely blood-red on the inside, a deep, bruising crimson that darkened to black at the edges. Second, the sawdust it produced wasn't golden or white. It was a powdery, ash-gray dust that didn't settle like normal wood particles. It hung in the air, swirling in tight, unnatural ribbons even though the workshop windows were tightly shut. By evening, the floor of the shop was covered in a thin layer of this gray dust. Arthur sat at his workbench, sipping black coffee, rubbing his aching shoulders. The silence of the night was absolute, save for the occasional pop of the wood stove. Then he heard it. SSSSHHHH. Arthur paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. It sounded like a footstep treading lightly on dry leaves. He looked around the dimly lit barn. The corners were swallowed by shadows, but nothing moved. "HELP." Arthur spilled a drop of hot coffee onto his thumb. He hissed in pain, setting the mug down. The sound hadn't come from outside. It hadn't come from the rafters. It had come from beneath his feet. From the floor. He looked down. The gray sawdust lay thick around his boots. In the center of the room, where the dust was deepest, a tiny eddy was forming. A miniature whirlpool of gray ash, spinning lazily without a draft to guide it. Just fatigue, Arthur muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes. He was 62 years old, and working with a log that heavy was bound to play tricks on his mind and senses. He locked up the shop, turned off the lights, and walked back to his small cottage next door. But as he closed the heavy oak door of his workshop, he could swear he heard a soft, collective sigh pass through the building, like a breath escaping a tomb. Act 3. Shaping the frame. Over the next 4 days, Arthur became obsessed with the clock. The wood was treacherous to work with. It was incredibly hard, dulling his finest chisels within minutes, yet it was strangely pliable under a hand plane. When he planed the surface, long, curling ribbons of crimson and gray would fell to the floor, stacking up like ribbons of dried meat. The smell in the shop had changed, too. The pleasant scent of pine and resin was gone, replaced by a heavy, copper odor, metallic and damp, the unmistakable smell of old coins and rust. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer isolated sighs. They had structure now. When Arthur ran his plane across the wood, sh-hitch-clack, sh-hitch-clack, the rhythm of the tool seemed to synchronize with a low, chanting murmur. On the 6th night, Arthur was carving the ornate crown of the grandfather clock. He was shaping the traditional broken pediment top, adding delicate, swirling flourishes. He leaned in close, blowing gently on a carved groove to clear away the debris. The dust blew back into his face. Arthur gasped, inhaling sharply. A lungful of the gray, metallic powder rushed down his throat. He coughed violently, falling to his knees, clutching his chest. His throat burned as if he had swallowed ground glass. He retched, spitting onto the floor, his vision swimming with dark spots. As he lay there, his ear pressed against the sawdust-covered floorboards, the whispers became crystal clear. They weren't speaking English, not exactly, but Arthur understood them. It was a chorus of voices, men, women, children, overlapping in a chaotic, desperate drone. The roots drink deep, the dark stays whole, count the seconds, surrender the soul. Arthur scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed a broom, throwing Vance's instructions to the wind. He began furiously sweeping the gray dust toward the door. He wanted it out. He wanted it burned. But as the straw bristles of the broom hit the pile, the dust did something impossible. It didn't scatter. It clung to the broom, climbing up the bristles like a colony of gray ants. The pile on the floor seemed to grow heavier, anchoring itself to the wood. The broom snapped in Arthur's hands with a loud crack. The dust settled back into its pristine, undisturbed layer. From the corner of the room, the partially assembled grandfather clock stood tall. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. The crimson wood gleamed under the dim halogen bulb, looking less like furniture and more like a flayed torso waiting for a head. Act 4. The Mechanism. By the 10th day, Arthur had stopped sleeping. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pasty. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the deep, bleeding red of the clock's interior. His throat still burned from the dust he had inhaled, and he had developed a dry, hacking cough that left a faint taste of iron on his tongue. The clock was nearly finished. It stood over 7 feet tall. The door to the pendulum chamber hung on heavy brass hinges, opening smoothly, without a single squeak. The interior was a dark, hollow void that seemed to absorb the light around it. At exactly 9 p.m., a knock rattled the workshop door. Arthur jumped, dropping his mallet. He walked slowly to the door and opened it. Mr. Vance stood there, identical to the night he had arrived, carrying a heavy, velvet-lined wooden box. "Is it ready?" Vance asked, his voice cutting through the thick, whispering atmosphere of the room. "The casing is done," Arthur rasped, his voice ruined by the dust. "But I want it out of here." "Take it. Take the dust. Take all of it." Vance stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the gray carpet of sawdust. He looked at the clock, a cold, terrible smile spreading across his thin lips. Magnificent. You're a master, Arthur. Vance opened the velvet box, revealing the internal mechanisms. But these weren't standard clockwork parts. There were no shiny brass gears, no polished weights. The gears were made of a dull, dark metal that looked like iron recovered from a shipwreck. And the pendulum. The pendulum was a heavy, teardrop-shaped piece of black stone, carved with the same swirling, chaotic patterns Arthur had seen in the dust. "Help me install it," Vance commanded. Arthur wanted to refuse, but his body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish. It was as if the dust in his lungs was weighing him down, pulling him toward the floor. Methodically, like an automaton, he helped Vance lift the heavy ironworks into the top of the casing. They secured the face, a blank, featureless disc of black metal with two bone-white hands. Vance attached the pendulum. It hung perfectly still in the dark belly of the clock. "Now," Vance whispered, stepping back. "The final piece. The winding." Vance produced a long, ornate iron key. He inserted it into the face of the clock and turned it. Clack, clack, clack. With a heavy, resonant groan, the pendulum began to swing. Act V, the final cadence. Tick. The sound was deafening. It didn't sound like a clock. It sounded like an axe striking a tree. The entire workshop vibrated with the sound. Tock. The gray sawdust on the floor leaped an inch into the air, dancing in unison with the beat. Arthur clutched his ears, but the sound resonated inside his skull. With every swing of the pendulum, the whispers from the sawdust grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of screaming voices crying out in agony and release. Tick. Arthur looked at Vance. The man wasn't moving. He was staring at the clock, his eyes wide with a manic, unholy devotion. "What have you made me build?" Arthur screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the dust. Tock. Suddenly, the swirling ribbons of gray dust on the floor began to rise. They coiled upward like smoke, wrapping around Arthur's ankles, his knees, his torso. The dust was heavy, cold as ice, tightening around him like a shroud. He tried to pull away, but his feet were glued to the floorboards. He looked at the grandfather clock. The door to the pendulum chamber had swung wide open. The hollow interior was no longer empty. The gray dust was flowing into it, sucked into the void like a vacuum. And then Arthur realized the terrifying truth. The clock wasn't a timepiece. It was a vessel, a cage. The voices in the dust weren't spirits haunting the wood. They were the remnants of those who had come before, trapped in the grain, ground down into nothingness, waiting for a new home. And now, the clock was hungry for more. Tick. The dust pulled Arthur forward. He fell to his knees, dragging himself across the floor, leaving two clear tracks in the gray ash. He looked up at Vance, pleading with his eyes. Vance merely looked down at him, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Every 100 years, the tree must be harvested," Vance said, his voice cutting through the noise clearly now. "And every 100 years, a craftsman must give it a heart. Thank you for your service, Arthur." Tock. With a final, violent surge, the dust wrapped around Arthur's face, plugging his nose and mouth. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. He felt his consciousness being pulled out of his body, stretched thin, ground into fine, microscopic particles. His body grew light, brittle, and dry. Epilogue: The clean shop. The next morning, the fog cleared from the Blackwood Valley, allowing the pale autumn sun to strike the windows of the workshop. The flatbed truck was gone. The grand black clock was gone. Inside, the workshop was immaculate. The heavy, choking scent of copper and rust had vanished, replaced once again by the clean, crisp smell of pine and beeswax. The air was perfectly clear. The floorboards, which had been buried under inches of gray ash for 2 weeks, were swept completely clean. Not a single shaving remained. The only sign that anyone had been there at all was a single, small pile of golden sawdust resting on Arthur's main workbench, right next to an unused chisel. And if you stood perfectly still in the center of the empty room, closed your eyes, and listened past the whistling of the wind through the pines, you could hear a faint, rhythmic sound. a sound buried deep within the grain of the walls.